Hello there, very good evening. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive with us tonight. It's time to see what's making the headlines. And tonight joining us is the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and also the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Very good evening to you both. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. They'll be with us now until just before midnight. So let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages, starting with the Mail tomorrow morning, leading on the news that the 5 missing explorers who were on an expedition to the wreckage of the Titanic were killed in what's been described as a catastrophic implosion. Also on the front of the Metro tomorrow morning, their headline, Titan 5 died in implosion. And the Titanic claims lives of 5 more victims. That's the headline for the Express tomorrow. The Bank of England has raised interest rates to 5% to try and curb inflation on the front of the FT tomorrow. The Guardian says there are fears of a recession after that rate hike, with millions of people facing surging mortgage costs. That story is also the lead for the Eye tomorrow, which says the Prime Minister has ruled out any tax cuts and has given the bank his support. Telegraph, on a different lead actually, reporting that Joe Biden has refused to back Ben Wallace as the next Secretary-General of NATO. And the Star says that Thames Water is blaming leaking pipes on a hot summer and a wet winter. Quick reminder for you that by scanning the QR code that you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us. And as we said, we're joined tonight by Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Let's have a chat to them now. Very good evening to you both. An awful lot to have a look at in the papers, as you can imagine. Some really big stories around, and many of them leading, as you can imagine, on the Titan's demise. Breaking news, of course, here on Sky this evening. Let's start with the front page of the Metro. And to you, Steve, what do you make of their coverage? Tell us about it.
Well, it's a grisly end. The unease I have with it is that, in a way, this is news for all the appalling personal tragedy involved. News really is a sort of rolling thriller over several days with an end which appeared inevitable some time ago. So it makes me slightly uneasy, to be honest, the focus on it like a thriller. And it's become a cliche, but I will repeat it. You've heard it many times on Sky and elsewhere, that there have been many equivalent or much worse tragedies which get less focus. But because this was such an appalling, self-contained kind of tragedy, it was followed hour by hour, like, as I say, something you can see in the cinema, and it's an appalling end. But it's a really interesting example of a news. Why is this a news story, and why are other tragedies given nowhere near as much prominence? It's one of the great interesting examples of what is news and why.
And I just actually want to bring some breaking news to our audience as well, and to both of you, because we, as of yet, haven't heard from the families of the 5 crew members who have perished in the Titan. But actually, in the last few minutes, we've had a family statement from Hamish Harding's family. Hamish Harding was one of the 3 Britons on board. He was described as a very successful businessman, a billionaire, some people have described him, and was well known as being an absolute lover of exploration and an adventurer. The statement reads, Hamish Harding was a loving husband to his wife and a dedicated father to his 2 sons, who he loved deeply. To his team in Action Aviation, he was a guide, an inspiration, a support and a living legend. Goes on to say he was one of a kind and we adored him. He was a passionate explorer, whatever terrain, who lived his life for his family, his business and for the next adventure. What he achieved in his lifetime was truly remarkable. And if we can take any small consolation from this tragedy, is that we lost him doing what he loved. He'll leave a gap in our lives that can never be filled. We know that Hamish would have been immensely proud to see how nations, experts, industry colleagues and friends came together for the search, and we extend our heartfelt thanks for their efforts. On behalf of the Harding family and Action Aviation, we would like to politely request privacy at this difficult time. So very heartfelt and full statement there. And Salma, bringing you in now, I mean, at the heart of this story, which literally has gripped the world, hasn't it, over the past week, the past few days, are 5 men, one of whom was just 19 years old, who've lost their lives.
Yes, and building on from Steve's point, I think it's important to remember that first and foremost, this is a family tragedy, and there are 5 families grieving for people that they have lost in the most strange and tragic circumstances. But the detail that we are now seeing from newspapers like the Metro and the Sun really detail horrifyingly their last moments. And the Sun front page that I think we were going to come on to was about how they perished in milliseconds after the Titan actually didn't complete its journey to the wreckage. So there's still a lot of gruesome detail, I think, that's going to come out about this. But as I say, this is first and foremost a family tragedy for those people who've lost loved ones.
Yeah, we're also getting some breaking news from the Dowd Foundation. That's, of course, a foundation for the 2 other UK nationals who were there, Suleiman Dowd and Shahzada. It says, with profound grief, we announce the passing of Shahzada and Suleiman Dowd, who were aboard OceanGate's Titan submersible. So just confirming from that family as well, the news that I'm sure they were desperately hoping not to hear. And just going back to you, Steve, I mean, the rescue now, the kind of recovery effort has been immense, hasn't it? Countries from around the world doing their very best to try and maybe find these men alive. And the conditions that we've heard about are just incredible in terms of how unhospitable it is many miles down, and the pressure they will have been under.
Yeah, but it sort of turns us all into voyeurs, doesn't it, really? It's unbearable. But as Salma says, in the end, these are a series of personal tragedies without sort of kind of wider global significance. And I say I do find it interesting that this is becoming such an epic news story. And I think it is because we go to the cinema and see these terrible kind of disaster movies and things. And this has been so close to it. And it is appalling. It was very moving when you read out a statement from one of the victims' relatives. But, do we need to read the sort of last minutes and the gruesome detail if Salma suggests we're about to be able to? I feel uneasy about it, to be honest, the way this has been covered.
OK, fair enough. Just one final comment from you, Sam, before we move on, because lots and lots of other stories to talk about. Questions about so-called deep-sea tourism and these kind of extreme trips. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, as the victim's family stated, Hamish, who's perished there, was an explorer, and it's something that he opted to do. And I think that people are going to have comments about this, and people are going to have a different sort of understanding of the safety around some of these measures. We don't know, I don't know certainly, and it hasn't been reported as to what those people going on that trip actually understood were the sort of risks that were involved. But this is such an emotional point in this story because we've just heard that they've all lost their lives. I think there's going to be a moment for that to sink in before we can rationally ask ourselves questions really about this type of tourism.
OK, let's move on to the Eye's front page tomorrow. The other big story in town, of course, was the interest rate hike and the reaction we've had from the Bank of England and also our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. The Eye reads, Sunak rules out tax cuts after interest rate hikes, or interest rate hits 5%, I should say. And then they go on to bullet point all the things which are kind of associated with it, including the Bank Governor, Andrew Bailey, saying, we know this is hard, but if we don't raise rates now, it could be worse later. Steve, what do you make of it?
Well, this certainly reaches all the qualifications for a massive news story because one way or another, this affects all of us. It affects the political situation. It affects the build-up to the next election. It's very hard for a government in the build-up to a general election to be in the context of rising interest rates. Sunak, when he was Chancellor, promised a pre-election tax cuts. He's now suggesting they could be problematic. I still think they will do tax cuts in the build-up to an election, but they have to be credible. And in the current contest, as Sunak himself suggests, they are an incredible prospects. So this is a really tricky situation for those hit by the interest rate rises. Politically, it's fascinating because it's not at all clear what the way out is for the government.
Yeah, Salma, let's bring you in as we look at the front page of the FT. Of course, it's their main story. They say that Sunak has said that he's warned Conservative MPs that tax cuts are going to be put on the back burner as he's vowed to keep a firm grip on fiscal policy. Of course, that's one of his main goals, wasn't it? His main promises or pledges was to halve inflation. He's got 6 months left. Is he going to do it?
Well, it looks very unlikely, especially as the FT is talking about people predicting another rate rise, in the next time round in the calendar, and perhaps going up to 6%, the base rate going up to 6% before the year is out. I think, as Steve touched upon, this is a huge story because there are actually three parts to this. One is the economic fallout, and that's what you see on the front page of the FT and other papers leading on the fact that this is potentially looking like a recession. So there is an economic question. And there is what we have just addressed, which is the political question, which is the fact that the Prime Minister is now not going to meet the target that he set out at the beginning of the year. And he has got a real big issue now with mortgage holders and how they're going to survive and deal with these rate rises if they're not on fixed term mortgages. And, that change is going to come for a lot of people soon. But there's also the third bit, which is the small p politics of this. And lots of papers have covered this too, which is anger about the way that this has been conducted. There is lots of criticism of the Governor of the Bank of England, who ultimately makes this decision with the Monetary Policy Committee, which sits in the Bank of England, that decides on these rate rises. And there's going to be a lot of that tension that also spills over in terms of whether this was the right thing to do or whether this was an over-tightening of a policy.
OK, as we bring you back in, Steve, let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. Of course, their major story is regarding the demise of the Titan. But safe as a Bank of England? ? I wouldn't trust this governor to look after my push bike, says Richard Littlejohn, one of the very famous columnists on the inflation crisis, reads the front page there. I mean, Andrew Bailey has come under a lot of criticism, hasn't he? He, of course, be the governor of the Bank of England. Is that justified, Steve?
Some of it is, but it's really interesting because here you have an economic crisis and the government only has limited levers. And Labour got great praise for making the Bank of England independent. The Conservative governments that we've had since 2010 have hailed the independence of the Bank of England. But when things go wrong, not least in relation to monetary policy, they start blaming them. Richard Littlejohn is not alone. It's reported in papers that Jeremy Hunt's advisors are briefing against the Bank of England and so on. If you hail this system, you've got to accept it when things start to go wrong and just leave it to the Bank of England. But I think they have made misjudgments. They had no choice today but to put up interest rates, given their brief is to reduce inflation. But that too will have consequences for the government, even though they're not in control of interest rates.
Yeah, not great reading for the government, is it, in tomorrow's newspapers? Quickly looking at The Guardian, as we say to Steve and Salma, we're going to see you shortly after this quick break. They say recession fears as inflation forces bank to raise rates to a 15-year high. The Guardian there focusing on mortgage holders and the fact that mortgage rates are now going to sadly go higher and higher. The Guardian also reporting on their front page a study that claims an ecological collapse is likely to start much earlier than expected, and a lovely picture as well of the Caribbean tea dance commemorating the Windrush generation as well. More on that and indeed the rest of the front pages as we get them here at the Sky News Centre. We'll see you shortly. Bye. Hi there, very good evening and welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me is the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and also the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Great to have you both with us on our programme tonight. Thanks so much for staying up late. Stephen Salma will be with us throughout the course of the programme and well into the 11 o'clock hour as well. So let's have a look at some of the front pages and find out what's been going on. Onto the Metro, actually, page 6, a story that we've covered a lot here, Salma, the Windrush, 75 years since that ship first docked at Tilbury Docks, and a lovely picture there, the King helping mark 75 years since the Windrush arrival. What do you make of their coverage?
The coverage is, as you would expect, largely positive. And I think that obviously the monarchy is going to have a big part to play in this, because we're talking about people who've come from the Commonwealth and who've served in the country. But also there is this sort of dark cloud that's been hanging over the Windrush commemorations because of the issues that the Windrush generation faced around their immigration, which a lot of the coverage has reflected. Especially around visa schemes and access to their entitlements, and people having been unfairly detained and deported from this generation. So there is a sort of a little tinge of sadness that is related to these commemorations, but on the whole, a very welcoming, positive reflection in tomorrow's papers.
Steve, the paper goes on to say that £75 million has been offered under the compensation scheme and £62.7 million is being paid out. But there is a lot of making up to do, isn't there?
There is, and this is one example of an attempt to do that. And Salma suggests it's a very, or broadly positive one, but it's very interesting in the news reporting of anything to do with Windrush, including something quite positive like the events being reported in tomorrow's papers. It's always, I think one of the papers says it was a bittersweet event, because you can't rewrite the past. You can address some of the injustices subsequently, but they're still there. So it's always going to be one of those running news stories where you reflect on money coming in to compensate, meeting the king and all these kind of things. But you can't wholly undo the past. And so there will always be a sort of ambiguity, I think, in the reporting of these stories.
A lovely picture of a Caribbean tea dance is on the front page of The Guardian, but another story has taken your attention, Salma, here. Ecological collapse closer than expected by their global environment editor. What's he got to say?
And look, I hate to depress anybody just as the day is ending, but there's a scientific report that is basically talking about losing the Amazon rainforest in one human lifetime. So this threat of biodiversity collapse, which is a very distinct issue and risk from climate change, but is consequence and interlinked, is actually something that is happening much faster than we expect. And it's interesting that even though it's on the front page of The Guardian, it's actually one of the smaller stories on the front page of The Guardian and doesn't really feature anywhere else at all. So it's one of those stories that actually has an enormous impact for us, but because we can't see it immediately or feel it immediately, it is somewhere down the pecking order as far as I suppose the news editors are concerned. And yet it is the kind of huge challenge of our times.
Just a brief word, because you're nodding, Steve. We could be the last generation to see the Amazon, briefly.
Yeah, it's so alarming. And I mean, I present this podcast where I talk about Sunak, Starmer, interest rate rises, the economy, and listeners write in saying, why aren't you doing more about climate change? Because it overwhelms all other stories by mountains, if mountains still exist in this context. And Salma explains why, because it's not immediate. And we're running out of time, which sums up the whole thing up. That
we are running out of time, but the good news is we can talk more about this in the 11 o'clock hour. So you two stay exactly where you are and be back to you shortly. Steve Richards and Salma Shah, thank you so very much.